20 or 22 weeks, and the reason for that is that the corpus callosum may not be. And of course, you will also do it later in case of abnormality, in which case you will do it in the late second trimester whenever required, or in the third trimester. But do remember that morphology changes with gestational age. So if you want to look just at my most favorite structure, which is the parieto-occipital surface, you do understand that it can be very shallow to start with and very pinched. And where this pinching starts is where we do the measurements, and therefore all of that is quite different. This business of the brain being different has been recognized for quite a few years now. And the morphology is quite different at 12 weeks, as you see here. And these are images from the ISBOT document. At 21 weeks, these are the three standard planes. But by 32 weeks, the ventricles are much narrower. We do understand that the aqueductus sylvis is no longer seen, and that the cavum septum is no longer so prominent. Therefore, you must realize that gestational age is important. The other thing we do realize is that as the head grows, the brain gets lost behind the bone which gets ossified. And therefore it might be very tricky to actually do a neurosonogram when we're going to be doing a study beyond 26 to 28 weeks of gestation. The neurosonogram encourages us to go beyond 2D, and the most useful indication really is to be able to visualize the corpus callosum. Sometimes you're lucky. Even transabdominally, you might manage to see one. Most of the time, you end up doing a transvaginal scan, but 3D, because it has enhanced contrast differentiation without the use of radiological contrast, will show you beautifully the entire corpus callosum and the vermis of the cerebellum by a single sweep by a transabdominal approach. If you use a transvaginal approach, then it becomes even easier. 3D is also useful because we end up using, again, that contrastiness to see the sun sign much better, to see the ventricular outline much better, and even in the coronal plane, you can beautifully outline the corpus callosum at a point where you can see the cavum septum pellucidum so clearly. And here, look at this beautiful demonstration of the corpus callosum, and you can see the vermis of the cerebellum, and you can see the brain stem so beautifully. When you do a 3D sweep, you can also cut across by either wider slices in any plane or narrower slices. So the coronal imaging becomes very simple. So straight away you get what we call a transfrontal plane. You will then get a transcaudate plane, a transthalamic plane, and a transcerebellar plane. So 3D facilitates this, 3D actual orientation, and you can play with it. The other technology we play a lot with routinely is to use color. The most useful technique, of course, is when we try and assess the corpus callosum by demonstrating the course of the pericallosal artery. And then you see just like this, and you can be sure that yes, there is no sunburst appearance and the corpus callosum must be there. We also use it for any cystic space that we see in the brain, because any cystic space may not necessarily be a water-filled cyst. It could very be a vascular structure, such as the vein of Gallen aneurysm. Fetal neurosonography also encourages the use of MRI as a problem-solving modality. And the two areas where it is particularly useful is if you have a huge amount of fluid in the brain, or for looking at schizencephaly. We've had something called the Meridian trial, which says that MRI gives you much, much more. But the Meridian trial was done in the northern part of England, and in the northern part of England, they realized that they were picking up only 40% of CNS anomalies, and the remaining 50 to 60 were picked up by MRI. But there's only one conclusion you can come with that if somebody's picking up 40%, then in the northern part of England, they need to be trained to do basic neurosonography. And there is no other conclusion, because you can't be so ridiculous as picking up only 40%. You and me do these every day, and therefore it's not MRI to be done for everybody. MRI only has a specific location, such as this case here. So here, for instance, we find that there's an obvious absence of the midline. I don't see cavum septum pellucidum, I see dilated ventricles. And here, inside the eye, I see an echogenic area, which could either be a cataract or a coloboma. I do a 3D, and I discover a depressed bridge of the nose, and then I say, okay, here it is. I find most of the corpus callosum missing, very few fibers bridging across, and therefore I know that it's a walker wobber, and I guide what I need. So this is how we shift over to that. In the next 5 minutes, I will tell you that yes, you do need to use a lot of transducers, and the transducer, which is transvaginal, is certainly the best. The next thing that you need to know is that the checklist that you need to use is always this, and it must be covered. Which means you look at the skull and the spine, the bony part of it, the lateral ventricles, the anterior complex, which is constituted by the cavum septum pellucidum and the lateral ventricles and the corpus callosum, the interhemispheric fissure, the sylvian fissures, the cisterna magna, the cerebellar hemisphere, the vermis of the cerebellum, any cyst-like lesions, and any other lesions that you see. Remember also that you have to go into detail, which means that you must see how long is the cavum septum pellucidum compared to its width. And it should be at least 1.5 times as long, and only then it is normal. And it's a great thing to actually be looking at when you're looking at this. Do remember that it disappears by about 37 weeks. The other thing you should realize is that the vermis of the cerebellum is always far more echogenic. And that is again something that you should realize. And beyond that, you look at the cisterna magna, and it always has reflections of what we used to believe were arachnoid reflections, but we know now that these are remnants of the Blake's pouch, and we always like to use that. Remember that the measurement of the lateral ventricles is also part of the neurosonogram, and then we have this kind of a measurement, which is the cross should have its vertical portion inside the black and the same on the other side. This is the marker point at the point of the parieto-occipital sulcus, and that is where you do it. For the midline, we use this plane from the front, and therefore it will show you the corpus callosum and the vermis of the cerebellum. And laterally, if you incline your transducer and you're still going through the anterior fontanelle, you will be able to see the frontal horn, the temporal horn, and the occipital horn, and the atrium with the choroid plexus within it. Remember that if you don't do this mid-sagittal plane, you will not be able to differentiate between normal Blake's pouch, between a Blake's pouch cyst and a Dandy-Walker malformation. And there's a huge difference in the prognosis. So this mid-sagittal plane, in fact, is truly moving on to actually looking at the we looked at even in your normal routine anomaly scan. Then, of course, we say, all right, the 4 coronal planes from front to back are the interhemispheric fissure, this plane, which is the transcaudate plane, the caudate nuclei are here, the lateral ventricles are here, the corpus callosum is above the cavum septum pellucidum, and here you have the interhemispheric fissure. As you go back and back, you have the transthalamic plane because this is thalami and thalamus. And as you go further back, you will notice the 2 halves of the cerebellum as well as the occipital horn. Remember that later in pregnancy, after about 24 or 26 weeks, if you look at this level near the sphenoid, you'll also be able to pick up the olfactory sulcus, and that can be very useful for syndrome identification. There are certain subtle things you should always look for, which we often forget. One is that the skull should have an appropriate shape, and if it doesn't have a right shape, you know that the lemon shape is for neurotube defects, that this particular kind of a cloverleaf skull will tell you about thanatophoric dwarfism, and a strawberry skull will tell you about trisomy 18. You also have to remember that you trace the entire bone from front to back and look for any defects either anteriorly or posteriorly, and something that you only rarely do, and that is to look at the density of the skull. If you look at the density of the skull, you have to press it. And if it gets pressed, you know it's not ossified, and that immediately tells you that you're looking at a dysplasia. When it comes to the spine, we do realize that the views that they ask us to do are transverse views and mid-sagittal views. In our world, with a high incidence of neurotube defects, we must also include a coronal view of the spine, because that can show you a lot more. This particular view should always be that, so make sure that you study this as well. Remember that looking at the spine is not just looking at the bones, but making sure that you see the level of termination of the cord, and that should be at the L2, L3 level, and you measure it by looking at the iliac wing, and that comes at the L5 level. So this is the way we look at this, and again for the spine, 3D helps tremendously because it tells you the relationship between the bodies, the lateral processes, as well as the ribs. Remember that you can see the other bones as well, such as the